Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Caleb Zakarin, editor of the New Books Network. Today I'm speaking with Martha Sandweiss, professor emerita of history at Princeton University, where she is founding director of the Princeton and Slavery Project. Marnie is the author of The Girl in the Middle, a recovered history of the American West, published by Princeton University Press. The Girl in the Middle begins with a haunting photograph captured in the year 1868. In the photo, we see 6 influential men surrounding a Native American girl. Until this work, little was known about the photograph. By unraveling its mystery, Marnie's book takes us on a journey through the American West in the post-Civil War era. Marnie, thanks for joining me today on the New Books Network.
Thanks so much for having me, Caleb.
Of course, I'm really glad to talk to you because I think this in many ways is a very unusual history book. It begins with one primary source that with not much known about it, and from that one primary source, you really explode it and are able to tell this story that was not yet known before. I think it shows what historians can do using their tools and apply it in a way that really just is basically kaleidoscopic in an approach. So I'm really glad to be able to talk to you, and I think that this is going to be a conversation that will be very useful for scholars that are trying to learn how to use their toolkit in a more effective way. But before talking about the book, I was wondering if you'd tell us about yourself and your background.
Well, I have a little bit of an unusual background for someone who ended up being a history professor. My first job out of graduate school was as the curator of photographs at a museum of Western American art in Fort Worth, Texas. From there, I went to Amherst College, where I was director of the art museum for a while and also taught history and American studies. And from there, I went to Princeton University, where I was a professor of American history.
And yeah, I was wondering if you'd talk a little about this project that you started and that we're the director of.
The Princeton and Slavery Project?
Yeah.
Because I had worked in museums early in my career, I was very focused on public-facing history. So not just history that unfolds in a classroom or an academic textbook, but history that's presented to a much wider audience. And when I first moved to Princeton in 2009, I was curious about why it was called the southernmost ivy. I actually know where Penn is, and I know that UPenn is a little bit south of Princeton. So I was curious where that name came from. And I learned that Princeton had very deep ties historically to the South. During my career at Amherst College, I had taught classes on public history, and one of the things we had begun to look at was some of the other institutional slavery studies, notably Brown's, which had been done early on, a study at Yale that had been done by graduate students early on. And when I got to Princeton, this is the southernmost ivy. What is the story here? And nobody had looked into it, and I couldn't find colleagues who were very curious about it. So I just started with a one-off undergraduate seminar. We taught it in the university archives, and we just began to ask the big question, does Princeton had ties to slavery? Surely it did. It was founded in 1746. And if so, what were those ties? And from that small, really informal undergraduate exploration, there emerged a large public history project that now has a large presence online, slavery.princeton.edu, more than 100 articles exploring Princeton's imbrication with slavery, many primary sources that have been digitized for other people to use. And so I like to think that now it's just part of the DNA of the university. The university knows this, students can know this, and it's a part of who we are.
I think for universities, it's very worthwhile. Obviously, universities are in many ways like factories for academic work that then are produced about things other than the university, but especially for a university like Princeton, where its history is so tied to the United States, to the founding, having many famous, notable people pass through. It's I think amazing to be able to turn the telescope inwards, look at the university itself and try and understand it. So I think that's an amazing project. I'm wondering, for this particular book, if we could pivot to that, if you could just introduce a little bit about how the idea first emerged for you.
Well, let me say this. I've heard the old adage a million times, a picture is worth 1,000 words. But somehow for me, it didn't soak in. I spent 130,000 words to describe this one photograph. A few years ago, I just began wondering, could I identify some of the unidentified people in well-known photographs, particularly of the American West, which was my academic specialty? Could I identify that gold miner? Could I identify that railroad worker? Or thinking a bit more broadly, could I identify that dead soldier lying on the fields at Antietam or Gettysburg? Somehow I landed on this one particular photograph by Alexander Gardner. And let me describe it to you for just a moment. It's a photograph that was made at Fort Laramie, which in 1868. At the time, it was in something called Dakota Territory. A few months later, it would be in Wyoming Territory. And the photograph was made during treaty negotiations. The federal government had sent a so-called peace commission out west to negotiate with the Lakota and some of the other Northern Plains tribes. And the idea was to push them onto reservations so that the Transcontinental Railroad could continue its march across the continent so that American settlers could continue to flow west without worrying about encountering the people who already lived there. So the photograph itself, as you suggested, shows 6 tall white men, all fresh from the Civil War, which had concluded just 3 years before, standing 3 on one side, 3 on the other side of a young Native girl wrapped tight in a trade blanket. None of them look at her. None of them reach out with a reassuring hand or arm. It's a very odd, formal picture. In the extant copies of this photograph, the men are always identified. From the left, General Terry, the man who would later find Custer dead on the battlefield. Next, General William Harney, one of the few Union generals to have been a slaveholder. Next to him, General William T. Sherman, who of course had helped command the Union troops during the Civil War. To the other side of the girl, a man named John Sanborn, who was a Civil War military officer and later became a politician in Minnesota. Next to him, Samuel Tappan, an abolitionist, a reformer, an activist who had served briefly in the Civil War. And next to him, a man named General Christopher C. Augur, who had stood guard at Lincoln's bedside after the president was shot in Forest Theater. So these are men who have well-known public stories. But in all of the extant copies of the photograph, the girl is never identified. On one copy, she's just called Arapaho. On another copy, she's just called Dakota. And I had to wonder, who is she?
Yeah, the photograph is in many ways, I think, as you described it, it's quite haunting photograph, and it can also be easily accessed on the internet. Obviously, if people search up your book, it's on the cover. There's also there's also other queries that can be used just to find it. It's on Google Images, but it is a really fascinating photograph, and I think what makes it also quite interesting too is knowing a little bit about photography in this period of time. So the photograph was taken in 1868 by Alexander Gardner, and you spend a lot of the early parts of the book and then also parts in the middle describing and discussing the life and the work of Alexander Gardner. So can you talk a little bit about Alexander Gardner and photography at this time period?
Sure. Thank you for that question, Caleb. One of the things I like to do as a historian is really go back to the sources. So there are books written about Alexander Gardner. There's some old articles written about Alexander Gardner. But I really wanted to go back to the sources and see if I could understand his life more fully, more deeply, or perhaps even in a different way. And as you likely know, the explosion of digital resources right now makes it possible for me to go to primary sources, baptismal records from Scotland, newspapers here, newspapers there, that earlier scholars really couldn't find. So let me tell you about my version of Alexander Gardner, which differs a little bit from the ones that have been in print before. Alexander Gardner was born in Scotland, and he really grew up a radical, He was interested in how a society could be reorganized, how people could live more communally. And in the late 1840s, he actually joined with a group of fellow Scotsmen from Glasgow to organize a utopian colony to be created on the American frontier. But as his fellow utopians set off across the Atlantic, Gardner, for personal reasons, had to stay home. So his family members of his, close friends of his, actually ended up in Iowa, where they created a utopian colony. These were watchmen, watchmakers, tradesmen, jewelers. They didn't know a lot about farming. And that utopian colony eventually failed. But Gardner's connection to it, I think, suggests his imagination. And part of that imagination is this, that the American West was empty, that a group of Scottish thinkers could just move over there and create a new world of their own. By the time he got to Fort Laramie in 1868, Gardner understood how wrong he was. The American West was crowded. It was filled with Native people who had lived there a very, very long time. In any case, in Scotland, Gardner studies to be a watchmaker and a jeweler. He gets involved in money lending. He becomes the editor of a socialist-leaning newspaper. And we actually don't even know that much about when and why he emigrated to the United States in the mid-1850s, but he does. And somehow, and again, we don't really know the hows and whys of this, he becomes a photographer working for Matthew Brady, perhaps the most eminent, well-known photographer working in the United States at that time. And shortly before the outbreak of the Civil War, Gardner has moved from New York to Washington, and he's managing Brady's photographic gallery in the nation's capital. He then gets caught up in photographing Civil War battles himself and organizing his own team of men. He eventually leaves Brady to open his own photographic studio. And Gardner becomes a celebrated photographer in Washington. He's photographing, President Lincoln. He's photographing generals, writers, artists. And he is, as I said, also working on some of the eastern battlefields of the Civil War. The Civil War helped make Gardner's reputation. After the war, he published a book called Gardner's Photographic Sketchbook of the War, a 2-volume album of photographs with which listeners were very familiar. These photographs are reproduced ad nauseum. But when the war ended, what was Gardner going to do? He'd made his living on portraits of Lincoln, photographs of the war. So shortly after the war ends, he accepts a job to photograph the construction of the Kansas Pacific Railroad across the Southern Plains. And a year later, in 1868, he's with a group of federal commissioners in Fort Laramie, documenting their efforts to make the Lakota sign a so-called peace treaty.
Yeah, that's it's amazing that a Scottish radical came to America and found himself essentially party to and present at so many historic events with so many historic people. And I think also, it's interesting to think about, photography wasn't what it is today. Obviously, there are professional photographers who do all sorts of setup and lighting, and it is quite complex. I don't want to downplay or minimize the profession of photography, but it was very difficult to set up and do photographs then. So to actually decide we're going to photograph these 6 men and this woman, that there was some thought or effort that would go behind it. So logistically, what was it actually like to take a photo at this time?
It was hard, Caleb. It was very difficult to make a photograph in 1868. Let me describe the process. Gardner used the most common method at the time, which is called the wet plate negative process. So that means you start with a sheet of glass, not unlike just regular window glass. You would have to coat it with a thick, viscous mixture of gun cotton and ether. This is explosive, by the way. So you would carefully pour this mixture onto a polished glass sheet and rotate it on your hand so this thick mixture flows evenly to the edge of the glass. Then in a dark room, now Gardner at Fort Laramie is working out in the field, so he has a tent set up somewhere that he's tried to make dark. In the dark room, you dip that glass, which with this thick, sticky solution on top of it, into a solution of light-sensitive silver nitrate. And then you put it in a dark slide. You put it in a kind of container that you would take out of the tent and insert into your camera. You had to expose the photograph before the negative dried, hence the name wet plate negative process. So you would do this, you would take it into your camera. Now his camera is a large view camera. His piece of glass is, I don't know, roughly 10 by 12 or 12 by 17. It's a large piece of glass here. His camera is already set up out in the field. It's on a tripod because he can't hold a big camera still enough for such a long time. He inserts his glass slide, his sensitized glass negative into the camera, pulls out the dark slide that's been protecting it from light, pulls off the cap of his lens, and just has to count out loud, half a second, 3/4 of a second, covers the lens cap, inserts the dark slide to cover his negative, and then has to take the negative back to the dark tent and process it. That has to happen within 30 minutes. Otherwise, the glass plate negative loses its sensitivity to light. He then has to process the negative in his dark tent. That means he has to bring to Fort Laramie with him his chemicals, his beakers, his developing trays. In some of the places he worked, he even had to bring fresh water because he couldn't count on the water from the rivers or the lakes to be sufficiently clean. Once he's developed the negative, he can let it dry, he can varnish it, and it's good to go. In fact, he didn't make prints while he was out in the field. He carried all of this glass back to Washington, D.C., and never saw prints of his photographs until weeks after he had exposed the negatives.
And this photograph, if listeners look it up online, like it is remarkably clear. It isn't like, the photo fades. If it's done properly, the photo remains more or less intact.
I will say that the image reproduced on the cover of the book actually comes from the negative, which survives in a division of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. So yes, the negative, if it's properly made, doesn't change that much over time. The paper prints may fade if they're exposed to light. They're, of course, subject to stains or tears or whatever. But I think it is ironic that 19th century photographs are likely to survive longer than the ones we make with our digital cameras right now. If technology changes, who knows if we'll be able to access the images we still have stored on our computers and our cell phones.
So for your work with this photograph, when you first saw it and you started asking these questions about who are the people in this photograph, why was it taken, what's the context, what are the questions that you found yourself asking, and then what are some of the methods that you took to actually trying to answer these questions?
Well, I didn't know why the photograph was made. Gardner was there with a federal peace commission that had been created by Congress in 1867 to negotiate with tribes on both the southern and northern plains. And Gardner published this photograph later as part of a series he called Scenes in Indian Country. The photograph was published on a big mountain with Gardner's name on it, so it was clear Alexander Gardner had made this, and it was clear it had been made as part of this particular expedition. But who was the girl? I didn't really know how to start. In the beginning, I thought maybe she's the daughter of one of the chiefs who has come to Fort Laramie to sign a treaty. One person, decades later, left a note behind saying that she was a translator. She looks pretty young to be a translator, but many people on the northern plains at that time were multilingual. They might speak English and Lakota or another native language. They might even speak French. But in the personal papers of the commissioners, in the official papers of the commission itself, I couldn't find any trace of a chief bringing his daughter to pose with the commissioners. And in the end, I did find out who the translators were, and none of them were women. Finally, In the archives at Fort Laramie National Historic Site, which is a national park site now, built with what's left of the old Fort Laramie, I found a little note card of the archives. And in 1878, a man passed through Fort Laramie, saw a copy of this photograph, and left a note. This was his grandmother, Sophie Musso. Well, the man who left the note card had died. I couldn't interview him any longer. But I could tell with historical research that he was 30 years old when his grandmother died. So there was no reason to suspect he might not have recognized a photograph of her as a child. So now I had a name, and names are everything. Names are what tethered people to historical records. Names are what let you find somebody's story. So I started with just the name, and I actually sent a copy of this picture to Lakota Times, a newspaper published in Pine Ridge, on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. And I ran it with a little note. I said, I believe this girl to be Sophie Musso. I would love to hear from any descendants. And I did. For the past few years, I've been in touch with some of Sophie's great-great-grandchildren, some of whom are ardent genealogists and historians themselves. But Sophie's name is everything. I really have unraveled her story. I know where she came from. I know who her parents were. I know what happens to her. And all of that becomes possible because of a name.
Can you tell us a little bit about her story, what you learned from her after discovering, and then also just, that's amazing too, it just shows how history continues to the present, that having that connection to living descendants can really provide also a gateway into understanding a person too. So you talk a little about her life, what you learned about her, and that, how you went about learning things about her too.
Well, sure. So Musso, it turns out, is actually a common name at Pine Ridge, even to this day. Okay. Sophie's story really starts 13 years before this picture was made. And really, Caleb, this is what can happen when you spend too long researching a story and you fall down too many research rabbit holes. You just find insane stories. I did find an insane story. 13 years before this picture was made, General Harney, whom we see standing tall and straight in his upright military bearing in this photograph, General Harney led a vindictive raid against a peaceful Lakota village at a place called Blue Water Creek in Nebraska. His men shot a young Lakota mother in the leg, and they took her infant and used the infant for target practice. It's a horrific story. His men then rounded up the woman who'd been injured, her name was Yellow Woman, and the other surviving women and children, and marched them to Fort Laramie. In that same raid in 1855, General Harney discovered that the Lakota people had ammunition that had been provided to them by French traders, who basically controlled many of the French-Canadian traders who controlled many of the trading posts on the Northern Plains. And he ordered those traders to come into Fort Laramie as well, so he could keep an eye on him. Yellow Woman and a trader named M.A. Musso were brought together at Fort Laramie in the aftermath of this horrific battle. They married. They became Sophie's parents, and they remained married for over half a century. So in the craziest of ways, General Harney was an accidental matchmaker, and an act of horrific, awful violence led to the creation of a loving family. So that's where Sophie comes from. Her father is a French-Canadian trader. Her mother is Lakota. Sophie grows up in various road ranches run by her father, ranches where he would trade horses to westward walking emigrants, food, ammunition, whatever. She grew up around Fort Laramie, but her father's ranches were subject to raids by raiding bands of different native groups. And after one raid in the spring of 1868, he brought his family into Fort Laramie. So they were there when the peace commissioners came to negotiate a contract. Sophie grew up in a mixed race world around the fort with her native mother and her French-Canadian father. Later, when she was quite young, she married a white Irish immigrant and Civil War veteran. She had 5 children with him. And then he fell in love with a white woman effectively kidnapped his children, one of whom was basically a newborn, and banished Sophie, sending her to the newly created Great Sioux Reservation, soon to be the Pine Ridge Reservation. There, where she had some other extended family members, she found a job at a boarding school in Pine Ridge, not all that far from Wounded Knee. And she was working in the boarding school on that awful day at the end of 1890 when American troops massacred some 250 or so Lakota people at Wounded Knee. She later marries a mixed-race Lakota man who's been working as a juggler in a circus, but is actually a skilled translator, and soon finds himself working for some of the anthropologists working at Pine Ridge, trying to record stories of the old days. And with him, she has 8 more children. So that's 13 in all, if you're counting. And she doesn't die until 1936 in the depths of the Great Depression on the Pine Ridge Reservation, one of the poorest parts of the country.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a tragic story in many ways. For you, when you were uncovering the story of her, I imagine at first, when you first saw the photograph, you were maybe imagining her life. Did you feel surprised? What was your feeling when you learned about her life?
I think I was stunned I could learn so much about her. Her father, the French-Canadian trader, lived long enough that writers actually flocked to him to hear his stories about the old days, and he did have an incredible memory. So long narratives of his life are preserved in different records. Her mother leaves a fainter trace in the records, mostly in official federal records, counting census sorts of records, counting people at Pine Ridge. But then Sophie's first husband, the one who stole his children and banished her, becomes a murderer. And his murder trial generates a lot of publicity as well. So there's just crazy kinds of sources that come to track Sophie's life. Her father filed repeated lawsuits against the federal government, asking for reparations for years' worth of, what he called Indian raids on his ranches and stolen horses and this and that. So again and again to federal agents, he narrates the story of his life. And it's a life that Sophie experienced because she was a little girl growing up on these ranches. So I think I was astounded that so much was there. But that said, there are no other photographs of Sophie. Although I have spoken with a number of her great-great-grandchildren, none of them have a photograph of her. So they had some fading stories. I had an old photograph and now some other historical stories. And, in the end, we put them all together.
The photograph is really interesting in many ways because, when you just look at it, there are only, I guess there's sort of 3 people looking at the camera, one person very slyly looking at the camera, but the 2 people looking are Sophie and General William S. Harney. Can you talk a little about General Harney, because he really is just in many ways he's an interesting and kind of a terrible person in many ways. Could you share a little about him and his role in this photograph?
Sure. And it's really interesting to see Harney and Sophie Mousseau together in the same photograph, because right here in one photograph, we have a man who was born during the John Adams administration, not John Quincy Adams, but John Adams. He was born before Lewis and Clark went west, and Sophie dies during one of Franklin Roosevelt's terms. So that's a lot of American history squished together in one photograph. Yeah, I've taken to calling Harney the evil general. He was a mean man. He was born in Tennessee. He was a childhood friend of Andrew Jackson's. He was an enslaver. And I really fell down another research rabbit hole with him because in the early 1830s, he murdered an enslaved woman who worked in his household. He beat her to death with a cheap rawhide whip. He was indicted for murder. He fled St. Louis because he was afraid of what angry crowds would do to him. He came back to St. Louis, where the murder happened, used his influence to move the trial to a rural courthouse some miles away where people really wouldn't have heard the details of the murder. and basically used his influence to get off. He got away with murder. He was a person who out on the battlefield was known for exercising no mercy. He not only wanted to inflict pain and death upon people, he wanted to destroy their food supplies. He wanted to destroy their household goods. He was an evil man. The records of the murder trial had been lost for many years, but working with some archivists in St. Louis, I was able to recover them in a basement of a courthouse in central Missouri where they had been put during the WPA in the 1930s. So they've now seen the light of day again as well.
Yeah, it's also interesting to as you put it, that in many ways, obviously Sophie wasn't there, but they're sort of reunited in a sense. Their paths crossed twice in a way, which is both sad and kind of fascinating too.
The West was a small world in some ways. Here, like I have to wonder, how does Sophie get put into this photograph? And we don't see her parents in the picture, but I'm pretty sure they're there, just standing behind the photographer where we don't see them in front of his camera. But what does her mother think when she sees this man who had murdered her baby? Her father, Sophie's father, had actually ended up working for Harney for a while. So maybe he's there trying to curry favor with someone who could give him some work again. Once you know Sophie's name, you get the sense of a kind of web of tangled enmeshments that have brought these people together for a decade and a half by this point. It is really remarkable.
Yeah, it might be lost, but do you have a sort of a sense of why the photo was staged this way? Why he, along with Sophie, are kind of the focal points of the photograph?
For all I know about Sophie's life, and for now all I know about Alexander Gardner's life, I really can't explain this picture. I think there's a few possibilities. Let's consider first what the photographer might have wanted. The photographer might have wanted a child to give a sense of scale to his picture. If you look at the picture, there are no buildings visible, there are no trees visible. Sophie and the men are standing on the gray stubble of last year's grass, which hasn't yet greened up in May of 1868. So Sophie gives us a sense of how tall the men are, for example. Okay, maybe Gardner was trying to make a more symbolic picture. These men are making a treaty so that the young children of the Lakota Nation can grow up in a different world. I don't know. But maybe Sophie's father wants her there because he wants to curry favor with General Harney, his one-time employer, who still has the possibility to throw some work his way. And one thing I haven't mentioned yet, I did mention all those lawsuits that Sophie's father is filing, but somehow out kind of in the middle of nowhere, they found a lawyer. And that lawyer, John Sanborn, is standing in this picture. He's also a peace commissioner. So maybe Sanborn wanted Sophie there because he wants to prove that his clients were at this place where actually they claim to have discovered some of their stolen horses. Lots of speculation, no concrete answer.
Yeah. It's an interesting photograph too, because the person in it that most people today would probably, recognize, or maybe not by image, but just by name, is General Sherman. And he doesn't come up as much as important in this photograph. He's just kind of there. I'm wondering why, maybe why, obviously you still write about him, but why he's not as central to your story.
Well, temperamentally, I'm the sort of historian who likes to write about the sorts of people other people ignore. And as you know, there's a lot written about General Sherman. If you read Sherman's long memoir written after this moment, he barely mentions this. I mean, the Civil War is the central moment of his life. And actually, some of the years leading up to the Civil War are very important in his life story. This, not so much. But General Sherman reminds us that all of the men in this picture brought older ideas about race to this place. All of these men had been a part of the Civil War. All of these men had wrestled with the question of slavery. and the problem of how to integrate the freed people back into the nation after 1865. Sherman famously helped lead a war to free enslaved Black people in the United States, but famously he also doubted their intellectual capabilities. He didn't want Black people voting. He didn't want Black people holding positions of leadership in the military. And that's pretty much the same thing he's doing here. He's a member of a peace commission, but deep down, he firmly believes that the way to bring Native people into the nation is through war.
Yeah, obviously he's not in the photograph, but to a certain extent, I feel that it kind of shows, the dark side or the dark truth of Abraham Lincoln's men in a way. Like these are the best and some of his best and brightest, in a way, and it shows that it's not just the narrative that people learn about the Civil War, that it was, obviously I'm sure you feel as a historian of this era and this period that people's conceptions of it are so oversimplified, but it really in a way I think shows a sort of a dark side.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And a related point I would make is this. In 1867, when the Peace Commission was created to go west and negotiate these treaties with the tribes, the Congress people who created that commission had American people on their minds. And they were thinking of a fix. How do we bring the recently freed enslaved people into the country? Well, we'll make them citizens, we'll give them churches, we'll give them schools, blah, blah, blah. And they pretty much thought that should be the same tool trick of kits they should bring west with them. But the enslaved African-American people had been living in proximity to white people. They saw things they wanted. You get a church, we want a church. You get schools, we want schools for our children. Native people didn't want that. Native people, by and large, wanted to be left alone. And their primary concern was having their rights to their land affirmed and protected. So the toolkit of fixes that these men in this photograph brought west, they show up in the treaties, but it was the wrong fix for the wrong problem.
Yeah. Just to, there's so much in this book. You really dive so deeply into the subjects. So I really recommend, anyone interested should really pick up the book. But I think, for our listenership, there's a lot of grad students, a lot of early scholars trying to think about how they can approach various subjects. And sometimes I think for people it can feel like, oh, everything's been written about. But I think you really show that even in stories or in histories that have been written about ad nauseum, so much work has been done, there still are entry points that at first might seem, very small, but you can then turn it into something really big. So is there any advice that you would give to scholars about how they might be able to think about approaching their work from the perspective of like finding a photograph and then just asking questions about it?
Asking questions is the key, Caleb. Look, this photograph has been out there for a long time. It was made in 1868. It appears in a bunch of textbooks about the Indian Wars. And nobody ever thought to ask who the girl was. That's where I started. My historical interest actually isn't in the details of the Indian Wars or the details of the treaties signed with the tribes in the 1860s. But I just started with that girl, and it led me to a story I couldn't ever have imagined. And it's really pushed me to think about what it means to write history, to get back to your larger question here. Alexander Gardner, the photographer, was an eyewitness. He met these people. He knew what they smelled like these days. He probably knew what they had for breakfast. He definitely knows what language the little girl is speaking that day. He met them. I didn't. But as a historian, I have a kind of superpower. I know what happens to them next. So Gardner just encounters them for a split second of time, but I'm encountering them in an archive. So I can find stories and details that even an eyewitness didn't know. I know more. I don't want to sound arrogant here, but I know more in some ways about this picture than the people in the picture do, in terms of the ideas and experiences they've trailed to this point. And I certainly know more about how their lives are going to unravel. These people moved apart. They didn't stay connected in the future. So I think that's interesting. But I would say to young scholars, I would say this: the digitization of resources, as I suggested earlier, has changed everything. You, as a young scholar, can ask questions now and answer those questions in an hour, maybe, what a much more senior scholar would have had to have spent 10 years doing a few decades before. So don't be afraid, one, to revisit old documents and ask fresh questions, because you have access to the keys that can unlock things your predecessors couldn't have. I would also say don't take at face value what's been written about people or things or events or places. Again, you have access to sources previous scholars didn't have. Don't be afraid. And don't be afraid to ask crazy, wacko questions. Who is a girl in a picture made in 1868? One of the big challenges I faced, and a young scholar might face the same question if they're starting with a crazy question, is how do you write a story? I'm starting with a photograph that was made in a split second of time. So there is no narrative story in this photograph. It captures a split second of time. And you've seen the photograph. Listeners can look at the photograph. It's boring. It's 7 people standing in a formal pose. It doesn't tell you very much at all. Photographs are sometimes called a decisive moment. There is nothing decisive about this picture. So how do you turn a split second of time into a story? Because historians are storytellers. In the end, I decided to start with the photograph, but then I stepped back and I watched everybody walk to this moment. I watched the picture get made, and then I watched everybody walk out of sight of the photographer. So that's a narrative arc of my own making that's definitely not included or even suggested really in the photograph itself. And I would just add one other point to this. Since 1868, the photograph really hasn't changed. Maybe a copy has faded a little, maybe a corner ripped, but the questions we can ask about that photograph have completely changed. And I would say that to a young scholar. Don't be afraid to look at a document or a painting or a photograph or a place that someone's written about before. When you bring new questions to that document, you can tell a completely new, fresh story. So have faith in yourself.
Yeah, I think that this book really is a, in many ways it's like a the word that comes to mind is like a clinic, like in sports where you go and you practice your shot. Like this is a this is I think in many ways like you're using your skills that you've honed as a historian and applying it to questions that are just naturally interesting to you, and trying to unravel it and find things about people. And I do think what's always interesting too is these biographies that can be produced about people that we think we know nothing about, and that there always is. I mean, I can only think about historians in 200 years, the histories that they're going to be able to write about any person, because everyone now has like this footprint that is just unbelievable. Like people will be able to write a history about anyone in the future.
Well, I understand why you're saying that, but the people I'm writing about, some of them wrote personal letters. Good luck finding a handwritten letter from somebody living in 2025. I have access to these paper photographs that have survived in institutions around the country. Good luck finding the personal photographs of somebody whose life is only documented on their cell phone. So I think yes and no to your question, Caleb. I actually worry that this kind of history will be harder to write in the future, not easier.
Yeah, it's certainly possible, especially because, as many people have experienced, things that appear on the internet can disappear, just because someone comes in, be it some for political reasons, or, just simply because they don't think seems important and they need to free up space. They'll delete things, they'll delete names, they'll get rid of pieces of evidence that can be lost forever because they only exist in a digital context.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I love the kind of digital archive realm in which I operate. but I'm not relying on websites. I'm relying on digital copies of documents. But of course, we may encounter an environment where institutions are pressured to take down those digital copies. For now, that's not where the censorship has landed, but it's possible. I think the bottom line is I do believe in paper, whether I encounter it in its physical form or in a digital copy.
Yeah, certainly, having as many backups as possible, in the physical world is I think becoming even more of a necessity. I think a lot of people are working on projects to recognize that, you can just having something in a digital format isn't enough all the time. Having a physical backup is extremely useful, especially for the work of historians. And I definitely think a lot about, and especially with like the New Books Network project of like of interviewing scholars, I think a lot about preservation and about how preserving people's voices in many ways. Like, I can only imagine what it would be like if we had the voices of Plato and Aristotle, that might completely reshape how people think about them.
Yeah, well, that brings up a really important point about historical photographs. Um, when the Civil War was photographed, for example, people were just, in a way, shocked, not just shocked at the photographs of violence that, is always more abstract when you read about it than when you see it, but also shocked because here was clear visual evidence that something happened. A few years after the end of the Civil War, when Alexander Gardner is at Fort Laramie and makes a series of photographs of the peace commissioners and the Native people gathered at the fort, those people did stand in front of his camera. I can tell you that. What you see is what there was. My book suggests there's many ways to interpret those pictures, but those photographs are honestly what I would call real. Those people stood in front of Gardner's photograph camera on a particular day in 1868. I don't think we can any longer presume that photographs we encounter online, and sometimes even in physical form, actually document a particular event. We all know how photographs can be manipulated. We all know how difficult it can be for the untrained eye sometimes to spot that. So maybe the golden age of photographs as historical evidence is over. I think that's something I haven't really fully wrestled with, but it's really something important to think about.
Yeah. And also too, like, photographs are a dime a dozen today. As you explained, like the logistics of creating a photograph in 1868 were they were complicated, and just to do it implied that there was some, even if even if this wasn't the some photograph that ended up becoming this this hollowed photograph that people refer to, it still is it still took people a lot of effort and time on that day. They devoted part of their day to this instead of just, someone pulls out a camera, takes a quick shot, and then it's over. So it is, it's really interesting.
Yeah, and it's because this is a deliberate event. I could use the word deliberate, and I would also point out that all of the men and the child in this photograph are collaborators because they all had to stand still, not for many seconds, but they really had to stand still for a second or two for this photograph to be made. The concept of a snapshot did not really exist in the 19th century.
It was less a snapshot in time than it was like quite literally like this was an event in time. They had to go and pose and do and think about how they were going to stand. And yeah, I mean, you have a lot we haven't been able to talk about, but there's a lot of really interesting for people just interested in photography and how people thought about photography at the time. Like there's a lot of really interesting things in this book too, just about how people thought about photography. Like people were scared of photography. They thought it was potentially harmful. I mean, maybe if you're actually doing the working with the negatives, it sounds like it might have actually been dangerous or harmful. But people were scared of getting their photograph taken too. So there's some really interesting things about that in this book as well. But yeah, Marty, it's been absolutely wonderful to speak with you about this book. It's a really interesting book, and I think appeal to people interested in both this historical period, but also just to scholars in general who are interested in just seeing, how to apply particular historical research methods to a single photograph. So thank you so much for being a guest on the New Books Network.
Thank you, Caleb. I really enjoyed our conversation.